Hey everyone. Tonight, I'm sharing a real spine-chilling story from Reddit. If you love horror, hit subscribe for more terrifying tales. Now, let's dive in. Don't watch this alone. The story of what happened began in 2009, a year my family would never forget. Back then, we were a large family. My grandmother, with her 7 children, had built a rapidly growing dynasty. Each of her children had at least 2 kids, except for my aunt, who never had children, and my mother, who only had me. In total, we were 11 grandchildren. Every year during the holidays, it was our tradition to gather and travel as a family. But the year 2009 would be different. My uncle Alejandro, a man with an adventurous spirit, had bought a farm in a rural area with a warm and temperate climate. The farm seemed like something out of a dream. A white house on top of a small hill, with 2 floors and balconies in every room, from which you could see the entire valley. At the bottom of the hill, there was a large parking area, and a little further away, a big, lonely, 1-story house hidden among trees. The landscape was so beautiful that sometimes we felt as if we were in another world, one where time stood still. But what impressed me the most were the sounds. The whisper of the wind through the trees, the singing of geese and ducks in the small lake, the distant neighing of the horses. It was a place that, although seemingly perfect, had something in its stillness that I couldn't quite understand, something I couldn't name, just like when a child feels fear but can't explain why. It's just instinct. My uncle Alejandro invited us to spend a few days at the farm. We were all excited. My cousins and I played and laughed non-stop. We swam in the pool, explored every corner of the property, and the fresh morning air was the perfect refuge for our endless games. Everything seemed idyllic, almost unreal. But after those days of fun, we had to return to the city. The children had to go back to school, and the adults to their jobs. My uncle, due to his commitments, couldn't be there all the time. So he decided to hire someone to take care of the farm and the animals in his absence. Mr. Ramon, a sturdy man with a deep voice, arrived with his wife, a woman with an expressionless face, and their 2 children, Esteban and Sarah. Esteban, a boy of about 9 or 10 years old, had a sad look in his eyes, as if childhood laughter had slipped away from him too quickly. Sarah, his sister, was a mystery. Though she was about our age, her behavior was more like that of someone much older. Quiet, distant, lost in thoughts we couldn't understand. Mr. Ramon's family stayed at the farm whenever my uncle wasn't there. But when we or other guests arrived, they moved to a set of rooms my uncle had built especially for them, a place separate from the main house. Even so, we shared the kitchen and the rest of the farm, and although it was sometimes difficult to ignore the fleeting glances or the awkward silence of Mr. Ramon's wife, the adults acted kindly, as if everything was fine. For us children, it seemed like the perfect situation. So much freedom, so much space to play and explore. During that year's holiday season, when the whole family gathered at the farm again, we ran excitedly toward the pool, laughing and chatting. We invited Mr. Ramon's children to join us, but their response was less enthusiastic than we expected. Esteban was shy, but his eyes sparkled with the curiosity of someone who wanted to belong but couldn't. Sarah, on the other hand, she always seemed miles away, as if her body was at the farm, but her mind was elsewhere, in another time. Most of the day, we saw her sitting alone in a quiet corner or staring at the horizon. What unsettled me the most was the relationship between Sarah and her mother. The woman was always cold and distant with us children. Never a smile, never an invitation to play. Her attitude was entirely different when she interacted with the adults. Then she became a charming, warm woman who made everyone laugh. But in the presence of children, her face would turn blank, as if she didn't know how to interact with us. It wasn't just my imagination. My mother and my aunts noticed it too, though they never spoke about it openly. Night came quickly, as it often does in remote places where the sun sets without a trace. We were exhausted, gathering in our rooms to sleep, while the adults stayed outside on the terrace, surrounded by the murmurs of the night. They laughed, shared cold beers and snacks, but something in the air, something in the stillness of the farm, made me uneasy. I, gripped by an inexplicable curiosity, got out of bed without knowing exactly why. I just felt an urgent need to get closer, to hear more. Maybe I wanted to ask my mother for something, but as I approached the balcony, something in the air made me stop. Instead of stepping forward, I stayed hidden in the shadows, unnoticed. That was when I heard the conversation. Mr. Ramon, with his deep voice, was talking to my Uncle Alejandro and the other adults. Something in his words made my skin crawl. Apparently, before our arrival, the farm had been rented out to a parish or a center that organized spiritual retreats. During one of these retreats, a group of nuns and young novices, women preparing to enter the convent, had arrived, hoping to find peace and tranquility in that remote setting. But things hadn't gone as expected. Mr. Ramon recounted that the nuns hadn't even spent a single night at the farm. Just hours after arriving, they began packing their belongings in a hurry, their desperation palpable. They rushed to the entrance and, between nervous whispers and hurried prayers, demanded to leave immediately. Mr. Ramon, surprised, tried to stop them. He explained that the road to town was long and that he couldn't drive them, as his truck wasn't available at the time. But the women, visibly terrified, refused to stay another minute in that place. They called someone, though Mr. Ramon never knew who. The only thing he remembered was that, after hours of waiting, a young man arrived in a truck, the kind used to transport crops or livestock. The nuns climbed into the vehicle as if the ground beneath them was burning, afraid to touch any part of that land. At that moment, the Mother Superior approached Mr. Ramon, and before getting into the truck, told him something that left him paralyzed. "Leave this place. Your family is being watched." The weight of those words left Mr. Ramon speechless. He had never noticed anything strange in his family, though his eyes had been clouded by the routine of tending the farm, and no one in the family had mentioned anything unusual. But that warning from the Mother Superior kept echoing in his mind. Something didn't add up. And later, when our family arrived, things began happening that he could no longer ignore. My mother and my uncle's wife, Estrella, had noticed something strange about Mrs. Ramon's behavior and her daughter, Sarah. The way she looked at us children, that coldness, that detachment, and how Sarah always seemed absent, as if she lived in another world. It made them uneasy, and they decided to speak to Mr. Ramon to share their concerns. That was when he started to remember, to connect the dots, and realize that something deeper, something darker was happening at the farm, something hidden until that moment. Then, I heard Mr. Ramon ask the adults about some crosses. Crosses? What crosses? His face was tense with worry. He described finding crosses in different parts of the farm, some buried, others partially visible, as if they had been deliberately hidden, in places we had never noticed before. Near the fountain, between the two houses, behind the hilltop house, among the trees, by the geese's lake, near the horse stable, even by the main entrance. Who had put them there? And why? A heavy silence settled over the night, as if something unseen was lurking in the shadows. Then, in a low, almost whispering voice, Mr. Ramon asked my uncle Alejandro, "Has anyone else been here when we weren't? Has someone entered without us knowing?" My uncle, with a furrowed brow, shook his head, but there was a spark of doubt in his eyes. He didn't know how to respond because he too had noticed something strange. It wasn't just the presence of the crosses, but something in the air, something intangible and invisible. Yet everyone could feel it. It was my mother who finally broke the silence, looking at Mr. Ramon with a serious, almost sorrowful expression. "That's not normal. We haven't placed crosses on the farm, and we hadn't seen them before. And now, suddenly, they appear. What's going on here?" But there were no answers. No one knew what to think. We only knew that something was out of place, something we couldn't comprehend. The next day, I was no longer myself. I couldn't behave normally after that conversation. My eyes wandered everywhere. I needed to confirm the presence of the crosses. I managed to find the ones in the garden, the one among the trees near the lake, and the one behind the main house. They were very rudimentary crosses, made of branches with a very dark hue, almost ebony, tied together with twine or some type of rope. I couldn't bring myself to approach them. Something told me I shouldn't touch them. But at least now I knew they were real. That same night, the air was thick and heavy, as if the darkness itself were breathing over us. Outside, the adults continued searching with their flashlights for something no one could see. Whispers and uneasy glances as they tried to decipher the source of a noise that had broken the night's silence on the farm. I watched from the half-open door, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw her, Sarah. She passed in front of us without making a sound, as if floating in the shadows. Her dark hair was tied in a braid. I could see that her gaze was fixed on a point beyond, a destination invisible to everyone except her. She walked with unsettling confidence, without hesitation, without even glancing at us. "Why is she going to the lake?" my little cousin Andres whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer. It didn't make sense. It was too late. The night was dense. The farm was immersed in almost complete darkness. And yet, Sarah walked as if she knew every inch of the ground beneath her feet, as if something were guiding her. My eyes instinctively turned to Mr. Ramon's wife. She remained standing at the doorway, holding her flashlight unlit in her hands. She made no move to stop her daughter. She didn't call out to her, didn't try to follow her. She just stood there, motionless. And the most terrifying thing was her expression. There was no fear in her eyes, no concern. Only resignation. A chill ran down my spine. My body urged me to act, to call her name, to run after her. But something I couldn't explain, kept me anchored to the ground, as if interfering would be a mistake. "I'm going to tell my mom," I whispered. And without waiting for an answer, I ran upstairs. My mother was lying down, but when I told her what I had seen, her expression changed immediately. She got up and said she would go tell Mr. Ramon. I clung to her arm as I followed her. but I never knew if she actually did. The next morning, breakfast at the farm took place in tense silence. Amid the clinking of cutlery and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, I heard something that made me shudder. Someone would come to take care of the crosses. My uncle Alejandro said it with firm resolve, as if it were the only possible solution. His wife, Estrella, looked at him with reproach and concern. My mother and my aunt simply averted their gazes and continued eating, avoiding the topic. I, on the other hand, felt immense helplessness. It seemed like I was the only child who couldn't ignore what was happening on the farm. My little cousins remained silent, avoiding any contact with Ramon's family. And Sarah? I never saw her again. Her absence also unsettled my mother, who asked Ramon's wife about her daughter. The woman responded with a kind, serene smile. She's sick, but she's recovering. As she spoke, she took my mother's hands in hers with a tenderness that made no sense. She seemed so genuine, so empathetic. But when I looked closely, I knew she was lying. The truth wasn't in her smile. It was in her eyes. You always have to look at people's eyes. That's where their real thoughts hide. The next day, we left the farm and went to the town. We needed a distraction to get away from that suffocating atmosphere. We walked through the plaza, visited the church, and bought some traditional pastries. For the first time in days, everything seemed fine. But when we returned, night had already fallen over the farm, and the first thing we noticed was the light on in the house on the plain. Ramon and his family left this morning for his parents' house, my uncle Alejandro said, frowning. No one should be here. We stopped in front of the house, staring at that single illuminated window in the darkness. Ramon must have forgotten to turn off the light, he tried to reassure us. Without hesitation, he walked towards the house, determined to check that everything was in order. My Aunt Carla, for some reason, took out her camera and snapped a picture of the scene. Minutes passed before my uncle returned. There's nothing strange, just a light left on, he said naturally, as if there was nothing to worry about. But my aunt didn't reply. She was staring at her camera screen, her expression turning to pure horror. Oh my God, my mother whispered, covering her mouth with a hand. I moved closer, trying to see what they were looking at. In the photo, in the lit window, there was a clear silhouette of a man, or something resembling a man. He was sitting sideways, his profile barely outlined by the light. But the most disturbing thing was his abdomen. It protruded unnaturally, swollen or deformed, and silence fell over us. My uncle Alejandro checked the image and shook his head. There was no one there. I went in. I checked every room. There was no one. But the image didn't lie. Fear took hold of the adults. They grabbed our hands and hurried us into the main house. That night, no one slept alone. They pulled mattresses onto the floor, brought blankets and pillows, and we all stayed in the same room, with the lights on and the adults keeping watch. No one mentioned the photo. No one spoke of the shadow in the window. And I don't know why we simply didn't leave that very night. By morning, the decision had been made. They woke us before dawn. Everything was packed and ready. We had a quick breakfast, and without looking back, we left the farm. The journey back to the city was long and silent. But once home, everything seemed to return to normal. Or so we thought. A few days later, my Aunt Carla was reviewing the photos she had taken during the trip. She connected her camera to the TV to project them. Only she, my mother, and I were in the room, watching the screen. The first images were normal. Us playing, exploring, laughing at the farm. But then, something changed. Spots appeared in the photos, circles, some dark, others whitish, like shadows floating in the air. At first we thought it was a camera glitch, but as we kept looking, the spots became clearer. If you stopped and looked closely, if you got close enough, you could see human features in them. Eyes, mouths open in anguish. Figures that hadn't been there when the photos were taken. My Aunt Carla turned off the screen immediately. A year later, my uncle put the farm up for sale. It wasn't easy to sell. More than a year passed before someone showed interest. And during that time, more things happened. But that's another story. The truth is, we never found out what really happened. What were those crosses? What was that figure in the window? And what were those dark and white spheres? My uncle was a collector of the strange and unusual. His house was a museum of oddities, antique dolls with cracked faces, rusted tools with no discernible purpose, and books filled with symbols no one could read. But among his collection, there was one item that stood out, one that he refused to display, a golden key, tarnished with age, engraved with the number 1903. He told me the story of the key the night before he vanished. It all began at a garage sale in a sleepy town upstate. The key was tucked inside a small wooden box, its lid carved with a strange symbol, a spiral encircled by jagged lines, like a vortex trying to escape its boundaries. The moment my uncle picked it up, the elderly shopkeeper's face turned ashen. "That's not for sale," the man said, his voice trembling. But my uncle was stubborn. He offered $20, and after a long pause, the shopkeeper reluctantly agreed. As my uncle walked away, the old man called out, his voice low and urgent, "If you find the door, don't open it." At first, the key seemed harmless. My uncle researched hotels, mansions, and even old prisons, trying to find a room 1903. But nothing matched. He almost forgot about it, until the night he saw the door. He lived in a small, 2-story apartment building, but that night, as he climbed the stairs, he noticed something impossible. A 3rd floor. At the end of the hallway stood a black door, its surface gleaming under the dim light. A gold plaque on the door read, 1903. My uncle froze. The building didn't have a 3rd floor. There was no space for it. Yet there it was, as real as the key burning in his pocket. The door didn't disappear. It stayed there, unnoticed by everyone but him. When he asked the superintendent about it, the man laughed. "A 3rd floor? In this building? You've been working too hard." But my uncle couldn't ignore it. Every night, he heard sounds coming from the other side of the door. Low rhythmic beats like a heartbeat. Whispers that seemed to call his name. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., a soft click, as if the door had unlocked itself. For weeks, he resisted. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. One moonless night, he took the key and approached the door. The air grew colder with each step. The key slid into the lock with ease, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow room bathed in dim, flickering light. The room was sparse. A single bed with a stained sheet, a cracked mirror on the wall, and a faint metallic smell that made his stomach churn. He stepped inside, his heart pounding. That's when he noticed it. The reflection in the mirror wasn't his. The man in the mirror looked like him, almost. But the eyes were hollow, the skin too pale, the smile too wide. When my uncle raised his hand, The reflection stayed still. When he stepped back, the reflection stepped forward, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. My uncle stumbled back, dropping the key. He slammed the door shut and ran, the sound of laughter echoing in his ears. The next day, the door was gone. But something was wrong. Every mirror in his house felt off. His reflection moved a split second too late. Its eyes followed him, even when he turned away. A week later, my uncle vanished. I found his apartment untouched, except for one thing. The hallway mirror had been turned to face the wall. When I moved it, I heard a faint click, like a lock turning. On the floor I found a golden key, engraved with the number 1903. Now the key is in my possession, and last night I saw something strange in my own reflection. Its smile was a little too wide, its eyes a little too dark. I think the door is coming back, and this time it's looking for me. What would you do if you found the key? Would you open the door? Or would you leave it locked forever? The woods surrounding Enniscraig were ancient, their shadows stretching long and dark even on the brightest days. The locals spoke of them in hushed tones, as if the trees themselves might overhear. But no one spoke of the woods with more fear than Liam, the gruff shopkeeper who'd lived in the town his whole life. One quiet afternoon, as the bell above the store door jingled softly, Liam leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Whenever someone goes missing in the woods," he said, his eyes darting toward a woman kneeling to zip up her little boy's jacket, "me gran would say, they'll never find 'em, not hide nor hair. They've gone under the hill with the old ones." Shay and I exchanged a glance. We'd heard the stories before, whispers of disappearances, of children vanishing without a trace. But there was something in Liam's tone that made the air feel heavier, the shadows in the store darker. "And if it was a child?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What would your gran say then?" Liam's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment the only sound was the soft jingle of the bell as the woman and her son left the store. "She'd say," Liam began, his voice so low it was almost inaudible, "they've been whisked away by the wee ones." The words hung in the air like a curse. Shay and I stared at each other, our unspoken question clear. What's he on about? Before we could ask, Liam rounded the counter, his movements quick and deliberate. He checked every aisle, his eyes scanning the store, as if searching for eavesdroppers. Satisfied we were alone, he locked the door and flipped the open sign to closed. "Hear me now," Liam said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "There's something in the woods and it hates us. All of us, to a one of us." Shay leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, Liam?" "What's in the woods?" Liam's face tightened, his thick fingers rubbing his chin as if wrestling with the weight of his words. "It's a malevolence," he said finally. "Those children weren't just taken. They were taken as a tithe." "A tithe?" I echoed, my stomach twisting. "A reckoning," Liam continued, his voice rising slightly before dropping back to a whisper. "For debts unpaid, for crimes committed in times gone by, and they all know it." He gestured toward the window, where townsfolk walked by, oblivious. "Every last one of 'em knows it, but they'll never say it out loud." "What do they know, Liam?" Shay pressed, his voice steady, but his eyes wide. Liam's face darkened, his expression somber. "They know we're never going to find those kids. Not a one of them. Not alive, not hide nor hair. Because of this malevolence? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The wee ones, Liam said, the name slipping from his lips like a curse. His eyes darted toward the window as if expecting to see something or someone watching. They're not just stories. They're real. And they want us dead. All of us. Starting with our children. The wee ones, according to Liam, were no ordinary fairies or sprites. They were ancient, vengeful creatures that lived beneath the hills in a world that mirrored our own but was twisted, darker. They took children as payment for sins long forgotten, dragging them into their realm where time moved differently. They bite, Liam said, his voice trembling. They bite and they don't let go. Once they've got you, you're theirs. Forever. Shay and I listened in stunned silence as Liam recounted tales of children who'd wandered too close to the woods, only to vanish without a trace. Some said you could hear their laughter echoing through the trees at night. But it wasn't laughter. It was screams. Liam's words stayed with me long after we left the store. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The woods loomed outside my window, their shadows stretching toward the house like grasping fingers. And then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle coming from the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my window. I wanted to look to see what was out there, but I couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the laughter stopped. The next morning, the town was in an uproar. Another child had gone missing. I went back to Liam's store, desperate for answers. But the door was locked, the closed sign still hanging in the window. Through the glass, I could see the store was empty, the shelves bare. On the counter, lying in plain sight, was a single note. They're coming. Lock your doors, hide your children, and whatever you do, don't go into the woods. What would you do if you heard the laughter in the woods? Would you investigate? Or would you run? Thank you so much for staying with me till the end. If you enjoyed this story and it sent shivers down your spine, please give this video a like. Your support means the world to me, and it helps me bring more stories like this to you. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on the next chilling tale. Your subscription inspires me to create better and scarier content just for you. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and don't forget to watch your back. See you soon.